Joining us today on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together every day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and discuss important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schmidt, your on-air producer, and today we're connecting with DORA, Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies. Rebecca Laurie is here to help guide the conversation and host us today.
Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Rebecca.
It's great to see you.
It really
as always.
is. Yeah, I love having our regular hosts come in and out each month, and I get to check in with you on a monthly basis, and it's always a fun conversation. Thanks so much.
And this should be especially fun because we have some great guests today. We have two guests from the Colorado Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform, known as COPRRR. The previous guests that we've had, they've been the directors of divisions that are under DORA. But COPRRR is unique in the sense that it is the agency that's charged with doing the state's sunrise and sunset reviews. So basically, they enhance consumer protection by doing these reviews and ensuring that regulation is necessary, effective, consistent, flexible, and fair. Overall, COPRRR's responsibility is to balance regulation and economic growth through 4 citizen-driven processes, which is what we're going to talk about today. And who we have with us today is Bruce Harrelson, who's the COPRRR director. He's been with DORA for 30 years. Under his leadership, the Sunset Review process has become a very active vehicle for government reform. And just under his leadership alone, there's been more than an 80% passing rate of legislative recommendations, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. And we also have Brian Tobias, who's served as COPRRR's senior policy analyst since 2005. He's conducted numerous sunrise and sunset reviews, and he's recently assumed responsibility of COPRRR's regulatory notice and cost-benefit analysis program, which we'll go into more detail. Overall, I think what we'd like anybody who is listening to the show to understand that what we're going to talk about is a very citizen-driven and reliant process. And so getting citizen input is very important for the regulatory process to take place. So welcome, Bruce and Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first, Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about COPRRR and the background? What is it that the office does?
Well, thanks, Rebecca. As you mentioned, we are with DORA. We're in the Executive Director's Office. And we were originally the Office of Policy and Research, and we were created to conduct sunset reviews back in the 70s, so 76 in fact, and we're now celebrating our 40th anniversary in Colorado of the sunset review process. And that process was hailed back then by the Wall Street Journal as an innovation in state government and an example of how states can keep regulatory burdens low. So housed in the Executive Director's Office, as time has gone on, the General Assembly has added sunrise reviews, which are the flip side of sunset. That's where we evaluate the need for new regulation. Then added the review of mandatory continuing education, which are requirements on licensed professionals to get education, keep up to date, and demonstrate that at each renewal cycle before they get their license renewed. And then finally, as we'll get into in a little depth later, the regulatory notice cost-benefit analysis, which is the latest thing that we've added and is a really exciting part of what we do for business, small business in particular. And I think, as you mentioned, we changed our name to COPRRR within the last year, and that more accurately reflects the statewide scope of the sunset reviews in particular. As I said, when sunset was created, there were problems with regulatory boards and not administering discipline. There was a perception that it was a good old boys network, and they just weren't working for the consumers in Colorado. And as a result, the General Assembly came up with this sunset review cycle and put that in DORA.
And as a result, that whole process now has been lauded as a great example for other states to follow, correct?
It has, and over time, it's I haven't done any recent tallies, but I know at one point there were 36 other states that modeled off of us, and I think we've been talking to some folks in D.C. about they're trying to create a similar process there now.
Interesting. So Brian, this is a pretty diverse portfolio, how do you ensure that all the voices are heard under this process?
Sure. So, Rebecca, as you eloquently put it earlier, I mean, these are all citizen-driven. Some of them are even citizen-initiated processes, and so citizen and public participation is really built into all of these processes. So, for example, the sunset reviews, which really constitutes the bulk of what our office does. Although the General Assembly schedules programs for sunset review, our research process entails a considerable amount of stakeholder outreach and public participation. And in addition to that, as Bruce was going to talk about a little bit later, we have an online system where citizens and members of the public can come and comment online, either anonymously or give their names. So that's one vehicle by which we solicit input. Sunrise and the mandatory continuing education processes are actually citizen initiated. To start both of those processes, we rely on the people of Colorado to submit an application to us to start those processes. And again, they both entail public participation and consumer outreach. A big part of our philosophy is that the more diverse the public input is at the beginning, the better the public policy is at the end. So we really make a conscious effort to go out and solicit that diverse input. And then finally, there's the Regulatory Notice and Cost Benefit Analysis Program, or the CBA program, as we call it for shorthand. That process is initiated, of course, by the agency that's promulgating the rules, but then citizens have the opportunity to sign up to receive notices of those proposed rules, and then to actually request a cost-benefit analysis be prepared. So there are lots of different places where the public can participate in the programs that we run.
So the CBA, that's I think one of the areas that maybe business owners aren't as familiar with. And so in the next segment, we're going to go into more detail to talk about what it means to request a cost benefit analysis and what business owners might be wanting to look for when it comes to the rules and regulations that guide their industries.
Absolutely.
Great. We'll be back with more with DORA, Rebecca Laurie from DORA. And we're talking about the Colorado Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform, known as COPRRR. We'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us today for Connect and Collaborate. Today we're connecting with DORA, Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies, and I'd like to thank Rebecca Laurie for joining us as host again today.
Thank you so much. I have two very special guests here, Bruce Harrelson and Brian Tobias with the Colorado Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform, otherwise known as COPRRR. And they oversee a very, very important process of government that I think not very many people realize truly exists and how they can get involved. So that's what we're talking about today. And we just finished talking about cost-benefit analysis. So COPRRR sends out regulatory notices, but they also receive and solicit actively cost-benefit analysis. And I'd like Brian and Bruce as well to highlight exactly what that is.
Sure. So, I think before I kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how the process works, giving you a little bit of context might help. Why should anybody care? But government rules, state rules, and that's what this program is designed for, is just state promulgated rules. They have the force of law, and when agencies promulgate those rules, they can affect individuals, but they can affect businesses. And so, if there's ever been a rule that somebody, says, I wish somebody had asked me about that before they promulgated it. This program is actually the opportune vehicle to make that happen. Our process is actually embedded in the state's Administrative Procedures Act, which governs how every state agency promulgates rules. It requires them to file those rules with the Secretary of State as well as us. They provide a notice and comment period. They have rulemaking hearings, and then those rules are finally adopted. And so where our process fits into that is sort of in that notice comment period before there's actually a rulemaking hearing. And our process is actually twofold. As Rebecca said, there's the regulatory notice piece of it, and then there's the opportunity to request a cost-benefit analysis. And so to even receive notice that an agency is going to promulgate a rule that may impact you, you can sign up with our office to receive those notices. Doesn't mean you're going to get every single notice of every rule the state promulgates. When you go to sign up, you can actually identify those subject areas or those departments about whose rules you want to receive notice. And then even those notices, we've tried to make really consumer-friendly or reader-friendly. They will indicate kind of the subject of what the rule is, so you don't have to read through the whole thing to figure it out. And there's also included in there a redlined version of the rule. So you can very quickly identify what changes are being made to that rule, what's staying the same, what's being repealed or deleted, and what's being added. And that can really help, someone who's not used to reading statutes or rules identify what's new and whether I care about this or not. And so that's kind of the sign-up process. So when an agency is going to promulgate a new rule, or if they're going to amend an existing rule, they file a notice with us. We will then send out a notice, as I just described it, to those individuals who have signed up to receive notices on that particular subject or for that particular agency. And then the recipients can review that. If they think it's going to have an impact on them and they really don't like it, or they really want to know more about it and what kind of impact it's going to have, they can request what's called the cost-benefit analysis. It's really easy. You just click a button on the notice page, and then you basically identify which rule you want to receive a cost-benefit analysis on, and that gets submitted to us. We will then work with the agency to identify whether a cost-benefit analysis should be required. Our presumption is that a CBA should always be required unless a handful of exemptions apply. And really about the only times we would say you do not need to do a CBA is if the rule is basically duplicative of a state or federal statute. If the rule is the result or being promulgated as a result of a state or federal statute, that really leaves the agency no discretion. And then there's another statutory exemption that frankly we've never used, but it pertains to the direct reimbursement of state funds. So presuming that we would go ahead and say, yes, a cost-benefit analysis should be performed or should be conducted, we will then send out a notice again to all those interested parties who signed up for it, and then they will know that a CBA is being prepared and what it's being prepared on. And I should take one step back and emphasize the point that even if you're not a stakeholder, if you're not signed up to receive those notices, you can still request a CBA. Those rules are still posted on our website. So if you happen to be trolling through our website and see it there, or if you catch wind of it through talking with friends or colleagues in the industry and you think you want to know more about it and you think a CBA should be required, you can still request a CBA that way.
And could you remind what CBA stands for in this context?
I'm sorry, cost-benefit analysis.
Thank you.
Sure. I kind of get caught up in the lingo sometimes. And so then once we determine this cost-benefit analysis should be prepared, the agency has a time frame within which they need to prepare that. And basically, they must produce that cost-benefit analysis at least 10 days before that rulemaking hearing takes place. And then, of course, individuals can go and testify at the rulemaking hearing as well. So those are some ways in which citizens and individuals can participate in the state rulemaking process.
And when we say rulemaking hearing, we mean rulemaking hearing before the state legislature. So, Bruce, ultimately, what does a cost-benefit analysis or a CBA consider? What does it look like?
Sure. I think that's the exciting part for business owners. And, when this process was created, it was really focused on small business to allow them to establish a connection with the rulemakers and provide input. So we developed a template that we give to agencies when we get the cost-benefit request from a stakeholder or a business owner. And the first thing we ask for is, what is the reason for this rule, so that they will communicate to the stakeholders why we need to make this rule. What are we trying to do? What were the problems that we encountered? The second thing that we ask for are the anticipated economic benefits of the rule. And some of these are driven by sort of economic statutory language, but if you think about them, they make perfect sense. Economic growth in Colorado. What effect will the rule have on that? The creation of new jobs and increased economic competitiveness. What impact can we expect from these rules, either positive or negative? And then thirdly, the anticipated cost of the rules. And this is the one that a lot of business owners really hone in on, because we hear a lot, both in local media and national, the cost of regulation on business. And when you start to really analyze it, it can have a major impact on a small business bottom line. So we ask specifically, what are the costs of the rules? And those would include direct costs to the government to administer the rule and the direct costs to a business to comply. And that can even be filing of reports, which sometimes businesses will have to go to their CPA, or, the sky is the limit on what might be required to put in a report. And then we also ask, and this one is a little more draconian, any adverse impacts on the economy, consumers, private markets, small businesses, job creation, and economic competitiveness. And I think what the General Assembly was getting at when they developed this was, we want people who make regulations that have the force of law, as Brian indicated, to think about the adverse impacts. I mean, it's kind of a given that they're trying to do something good. Regulators are passing rules to fix a problem. I mean, they want to do something positive. But we need, as regulators, we need to think about the potential adverse impacts of the rules that we are creating, and then those will be in the cost-benefit analysis. And then finally, we ask for 2 alternatives to the proposed rule, including the cost and benefits of each. And again, that would be the cost to the government and the businesses, as well as the benefits to our economy of the rules. And so the exciting thing, if you are one of our stakeholders, is that you get this document, this cost-benefit analysis that is prepared. It addresses all of these areas, and then you have some time to go over that, to review it, and ideally, you as the business owner can then weigh in to the regulatory process. You can go to the hearing, or you can submit your comments in another way to the promulgating agency. And as an example, you could say, well, I see your two alternatives. I really think you ought to consider the second alternative. We can achieve the same thing with less cost by going this route, and maybe all we have to do is tweak it right here. And then the agency will take that into consideration, have the hearing, and maybe, create kind of a hybrid. But it's a big difference from years ago when these rulemaking authorities made rules and you just sort of found out about them. And now you can participate in their creation.
So, do you have an example?
Yeah, one of the one I think really big example for me is a rule that was tried to be promulgated just within the last couple of months, and it pertained to massage therapy, and it was an instance in which we actually received, I think it was 3 or 4 different requests for a cost-benefit analysis on the same rule, and when the agency stopped and took a look at it, they didn't actually have to prepare the cost-benefit analysis, because when they looked at it, they said, we really think there might be a better way to do this. So they actually rescinded the rule. So the end result was not a cost-benefit analysis, but I think it's a great example of how this program and this process really affords citizens and members of the public to directly impact the workings of government.
So how do people go online and submit an analysis? Is it pretty clear on your website where they can go? Can you give some guidance on that?
So members of the public can go directly to our website, and we've got a button that says, I think it says request a CBA.
And that's
you can get it.
DORA.colorado.gov/OPR.
Right.
Okay, and we'll be back with more with Dora right after this break. Stay with us on Connect and Collaborate. Thanks for staying with us today on Connect and Collaborate. Today we're connecting with DORA, Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies. Rebecca Laurie is our host. We're glad to have you back.
It's great to be here, always.
Thanks. And today we've been talking about the sunrise and sunset review processes, and we're going to focus in this segment on the sunset review. And it seems like this is what most people are going to feel like they're familiar with, right?
Yeah, Bruce, it would be great if you could highlight exactly, what is a sunset review? How do you determine which agencies to review, and how do you go about conducting those reviews?
Absolutely. Let me backtrack just for a minute, though. When I talked about sunset originally, and I mentioned that we had these problems with regulatory boards, and the General Assembly created sunset.
Back in the 1970s.
Exactly. So the way that worked was they decided that for this review process, they were going to put a date certain that an agency or a board would terminate. And then prior to that termination date, a review would be conducted, and that was a very novel idea to actually put in the law. This agency will go out of business and close its doors on July 1 of this given year. And so that is how sunset got created, and that methodology was used to make sure that there was a good analysis and a hearing before the General Assembly. And so you asked me about scheduling. I'm really glad you asked that question, because one thing I hear over and over from people is, well, how do you decide who you're going to sunset? Because it does have sort of a connotation of getting rid of an agency. And that happens. Over the years, we've sunsetted probably 58, 60 programs, and then a number of other regulatory agencies or processes were combined for efficiency. Well, we don't really have anything to do with that at DORA. The General Assembly schedules every agency that's scheduled for review. And that review schedule is set up in statute, and there's plenty of notice of it coming, and it has to pass the entire General Assembly to put an agency in. So that's where the schedule comes from, and that directs our workload each year. The other thing that they have in statute are the 10 statutory criteria that guide the review. So Brian and I don't just come in and write a white paper about regulatory stuff. There are these criteria. We use them to evaluate, and they will be, should this agency, they are an example, should this agency be continued for the protection of the public? Have the economic conditions that existed when the regulation was created changed? Is their regulatory structure the least restrictive consistent with the public benefit? So those are the kind of things that we look at when we conduct a review. And not to get too far in the weeds, but we start out with a very thorough statutory review, and then we begin the stakeholder process, which is really the key to a successful review. In fact, usually the first thing we do when we meet with an agency is give us your stakeholder list. Who are the people that communicate with you and that you communicate with? And then we contact them. And we conduct interviews. We go to their places of business if they wish. We conduct a lot of surveys, and we gather from them, the stakeholders, what the problems are with the regulatory structure. And then we will work to craft recommendations, assuming we're going to recommend to continue it, recommendations to improve those situations and correct those problems. And as I keep repeating, I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record, but we really rely on stakeholder input. A number of our reviews, we have well over 100 stakeholders that we interview for a review. And
so it's not done in a vacuum, essentially.
Oh, precisely.
Right.
And it just creates a much better product, and a product that has a lot of buy-in when it goes to the legislature. I should probably mention that. Our reviews come out in October each year, and then they are heard before a legislative committee the next session. And then a bill is created, a bill from our draft recommendations, and that bill goes through the entire General Assembly like any other bill. So that's another point where stakeholders can come into the process and testify at the bill, but that's often very cumbersome and difficult for business owners to do, and almost anyone. So that's why we really like to bring them in at the beginning, and in a way that is really beneficial for them, makes it easy for them to get in. And as I said, October, it reminded me the sunrise reviews are also published in October, October 15th to be precise. And those are all available on our website. So I think that's kind of the key to Sunset. I mean, the important thing is that it scheduled reviews, scheduled agencies for an automatic termination unless the General Assembly chooses to continue them. And we try to operate this in a way that all citizens and stakeholders can have plenty of input. And again, you don't have to wait on us to contact you. If you find out through your association that there's a sunset review, just reach out online, call us, whatever. We'll be glad to sit down and talk with you.
And we'll give out the contact information a little towards the end of the show. But I do want to pass this over to Brian because this is a comprehensive process, and sunset reports generate automatic legislation. And this year there were 22 reviews that came out in October. So can you give an example, Brian, of one of those reviews that will be going, before the General Assembly? Absolutely.
I've got two that I think really tie into that dichotomy Bruce was talking about with is our programs necessary to protect the public, and if so, do they represent the least restrictive form of government consistent with the public interest? That really kind of forces that classic balancing act of consumer protection on the one hand with overregulation on the other. And so two recommendations from two different reports I think really exemplify how we come at this balancing act essentially. One of the reviews we just published in October was of the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. This is an agency that regulates new and used car dealers, salespeople, manufacturers, and so on. And embedded within that statute that agency administers is what we often call a blue law. There used to be quite a few of them on the books. They basically prohibited certain conduct from occurring on Sundays. One pretty well-known blue law pertained to the sale of alcohol, which of course the state repealed several years ago. But another one also prohibits the sale of cars on Sunday. So if you've ever been driving down, Havana or any of the other major streets where there are lots of car dealers and you notice they were all closed on Sunday, if you wondered why are they all closed, it's because there's actually a state law that prohibits them from selling cars on Sunday. Well, applying our criteria, is this necessary to protect the public? We could really identify no valid public policy reason as to why car dealers should not be allowed to sell their cars on any particular day of the week. So one of our recommendations is to repeal that prohibition and allow them to operate on Sundays. Another example pertains to the Division of Insurance Sunset Review. There is an industry out there known as the pre-need funeral contracts. This is a process whereby an individual consumer can buy today the goods and services that their family would need to cover their funeral in the future. There are actually two sides of this industry. There's one that's backed up by a life insurance policy and another one that's backed up by a trust or a trust account. And we identified some problems with the trust account side of the industry. We identified some problems where over the course of about a decade, $2 million went missing. Whether that occurred through misappropriation or whether it was lost or through theft. We thought this was a problem, that when a family goes and needs those funds, they're not there. So we've recommended the creation of a recovery fund so that when a consumer's family goes to make a claim on that contract, they can be made whole. And we've also recommended some additional financial safeguards. But I think those two really kind of exemplify that dichotomy of consumer protection versus overregulation.
Fascinating. So ultimately, the stakeholder process also helped guide you to come to that recommendation, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to being able to sell cars on a Sunday, it was stakeholders that said, yeah, there really is not necessary to have that law anymore.
It was really the criteria that drove us to ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, through the stakeholder process, we could identify no valid reason to keep them closed.
Interesting. We'll be back with more with the Department of Regulatory Agencies here on Connect and Collaborate. We're so glad you're staying with us today for Connect and Collaborate. And today's our monthly show edition with DORA, Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies. And Rebecca Laurie is here to lead the conversation as our host.
It's been a very fascinating conversation because we're here with Bruce and Brian from the Colorado Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform. We're talking about cost-benefit analysis. We're talking about sunrise and sunset reviews and why that should matter to your average business owner and even your average citizen and why they should get involved.
Right.
So one of the things that we were just talking about was the sunset review process. And, just as soon as they release reviews in October, you're on to the next batch of reviews that you're working on for the year. So you have a pretty aggressive review schedule. Are there any reviews that are already in progress?
Absolutely. It's actually kind of ironic. We had 22 reviews last year, and we actually have 22 reviews this year. In all the years I've been doing this, I don't think we've ever had exactly the same number of reviews 2 years in a row. But some of the more interesting reviews that we're working on right now pertain to, for example, community association managers. So a lot of us live in homeowners associations, and these are the individuals who run and manage those associations. So I imagine we'll have a lot of interesting input from members of the public on that one. But kind of one of the more quirky, truly interesting reviews I think we're working on has to do with weather modification. Excuse me, and that's cloud seeding. I recently saw something online about the 50 states and the unique laws in each state, and this happened to be the one that was identified for Colorado. So I thought that was sort of interesting. And again, we look at all of these, all 22 of them, we look at through the lens of consumer protection. Is this program necessary to protect the public?
Which leads to sunrise reviews, because that you use that same lens when there's a proposal to bring a regulatory program on board. Can you describe that a little bit, Bruce?
Sure. Sunrise is the just the other side of the coin of sunset, because it doesn't make any sense to get rid of unnecessary regulation while you're busily passing new unneeded regulation. So sunrise is a process that looks at, are consumers being harmed in an unregulated marketplace? If they are, would regulation solve that problem? And if so, what kind of regulation? And an interesting, this is another citizen-driven part of our work, and it kind of harkens back to what I said earlier, because I always get these questions when I talk about sunrise. Almost all of our sunrise applications come from the practitioners. They want the government to regulate their profession or occupation. I think there's a perception out there that government in its ivory tower decides we're going to regulate all of these things. But in my experience, and this has been in operation since the mid-'80s, almost all of them come from the practitioners saying we need to be regulated. And a lot of citizens are just surprised by that. So
I can see that, because if they feel like they're operating their business the right way or ethically, they want the others in the industry to do the same. So it probably comes from that.
That's absolutely correct, and that's the argument that we have folks who are just not competent, who are harming people, and that is all part of the analytical lens that we use. It's just that our Colorado process requires that be proven,
Okay.
not simply asserted. So that's where we
Sure.
come in
Yeah.
and look, because there are benefits to being regulated. Kind of the flip side of what you were talking about, it does reduce competition, and that can drive up prices to consumers. So the sunrise process is really important, and it's another example of an opportunity for folks to just get in touch with COPRRR, because these applications, we have them online, so you can go back to our online services and file an application. And our deadline for that is December 1 of any given year, so you still have a week to get those apps in. And then the process is very similar to the others. This one is very heavy on stakeholder input. We will contact professions, go out and talk to them. We will talk to other professions that might be impacted by the regulation and see what they have to say. And we look at other states to find out how, if the profession or occupation is regulated in those states, and if so, how they do it and what kind of problems they're having. We look at their consumer complaints, disciplinary actions, where they all dismissed. So from all of that, then we put together a report that goes to the General Assembly with a recommendation as to whether or not regulation is needed here. And an important distinction, there's no predetermined hearing for a sunrise review. So we conduct the review, we publish it October 15th, and then it's up to the folks who want regulation to find the legislator to carry the bill. And we will only testify on a bill like that if we are requested, but we inform the process, inform the General Assembly.
And so if members of the public, business owners, they want to find out more about sunrise applications, they can go to dora.colorado.gov/OPR and click on how reviews work to get a better understanding of it. And then there's also a sunrise reviews button in the middle of that page to see the current reviews. Brian, can you give us an example of some of the reviews that were released just this past October? Actually, even just one is about all we have time for.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually produced 3 sunrise reviews this last year having to do with process servers, art therapists, and cannabis growers. And process servers is the sole report in which we recommended regulation should be imposed. And process servers are the individuals who come out and serve individuals with that wonderful piece of paper that says you are being sued. So that's
subpoenas and
what everyone is looking forward to. And, but these are folks, who come to your place of business. They come to your home. Maybe they're waiting for you at your car. You have no say in who they are as a consumer being served. And so we recognize that there is a high potential for harm there, and we recommended in favor of regulation. A fairly minimal level of regulation. Basically, I think we did background checks and a jurisprudence exam just so these individuals know where those boundaries are that they need to stay within.
They should have a
when they're
jacket
serving.
that says processor on it or something too, so you know what you're dealing with when they walk up.
Or not open the door.
So then that will go before the General Assembly, is that correct?
Well, as Bruce indicated, it's not really up to us. Sunrise does not generate automatic legislation like Sunset does.
Okay.
It will be up to the organization that submitted the application to move forward with a bill if they can find a bill sponsor, and then move forward with legislation next year.
I see. So just because there is a sunrise review conducted doesn't necessarily mean that there is automatic legislation. There's a couple of steps before that, and it's good to be aware of that before perhaps initiating a request.
Right. That's absolutely right.
Okay.
We've conducted a lot of reviews that didn't result in legislation, everything from tanning facilities to human trackers.
So there's several ways that citizens, business owners, people invested or want to become invested in this process can participate. One of the key ways is by going online to the COPRRR website, dora.colorado.gov/OPR, and learning all the different ways that they can get involved, signing up for those regulatory notices, making sure that they're searching for perhaps any reviews that have been conducted in the past. And I'd like to reiterate what Bruce and Brian said, and that is that by getting involved in the process, it means that you have a direct voice in the types of rules and regulations that are either created or not created that guide many different kinds of industries. When somebody has questions, how do they reach out to you if they want to ask you a question directly? Can they just give you a call?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they can submit an email again through that, or you can just give Brian or myself a call, and we'll be
What-
glad to talk with
What's
you.
your number, Bruce?
Let's see. I never call it. It's 303-894-2993.
And your email address is bruce.harrelson, HARRELSON, at state.co.us.
Right. Yeah. And I look forward to hearing from everyone.
That's wonderful. And again, more information at dora.colorado.gov/OPR. And thank you so much, Rebecca Laurie from DORA, joining us today. And to Bruce Harrelson and Brian Tobias for joining in.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Great
Thank you so
conversation.
much.
And
Thank
thank
you,
you for
Tammy.
listening to Connect and Collaborate. Have a great evening.